Hi, this is Rob Packard from Medical Device Academy. Today's webinar is on design controls. The FDA regulation for this is 21 CFR 820.30, that's a subsection, .30. And it also is the same requirement for ISO 1345 2016, clause 7.3. This is the 2018 update, and I've recorded it. I think this is now my fourth time. So if anybody out there knows how to keep a MP4 file from getting corrupted during the recording process and only recording the first 30 seconds, let me know. But this seems to happen every once in a while, and so I'm recording this one again. This is actually probably like the 6th or 7th time I've actually recorded design controls, but this particular video the update, I've recorded now the 3rd time. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me or call me. If you have any problems with the recording, let me know. But hopefully the 3rd time's a charm. So one of the reasons why we teach design controls and why it's so important to learn design controls is it is the most common 483 that the FDA gives. 483 is just the form number of FDA observations during an inspection. And it's slightly misleading because there are 8 different subclauses that somebody can write you up for at the FDA if they're doing an inspection that are all related to design. So you could get written up for you don't have a design control procedure. You could say they haven't validated design changes. They haven't done design transfer. The list goes on. So if you divided that number of nonconformities or 483 observations by 8, you'd have a much smaller number that would be more in line with some of these other ones. But collectively, design controls is the #1 hitter for 483s during FDA inspections. The FDA has 4 key areas that they look at during inspections: design controls, CAPA, investigation of complaints goes with the CAPAs, adverse event reporting goes with CAPAs. Then they look at production process controls, and they look at management systems. So there are these 4 key areas that they look at, and design controls is one of the 4 key areas. If you want to learn more about the FDA inspection process, they actually have a manual for it. It's called the QZIP manual. Here's a hyperlink for it. There's also a how-to guidance document the FDA published, but I actually have my own webinar that I did on FDA inspections and how to prepare for them. And one of the things you'll experience when you go through an FDA inspection is they will ask for your design control procedure, then they will ask for your design history file, then they'll ask for the device master record for that same file, and then they'll sample DHRs or device history records for each lot or several lots of your product. And you can see as soon as they ask for a design history file, that's usually the device family or specific device they're going to focus on for the rest of the inspection. So that tells you what records they're going to pull. So when they ask for complaint records, don't just give them all your complaint records. Ask for what products do you want the complaint records for? Because maybe they only want the complaint records for this specific product family. And so that's the DHF you're going to give them, not all your DHFs. That's the DMR you're going to give them, not all your DMRs. And when they ask for DHRs, you're going to say, which lots in this family do you want? And usually they'll just sample from it. So that's important to know, and that's the sequence they'll be asking so you can prepare ahead of time and not keep the FDA inspector waiting. This is the famous waterfall diagram that the FDA has published in their guidance and has on their website, but it originally was prepared by Health Canada. So it says reprinted with permission from Health Canada. I recreated one that looks pretty much the same myself here, but this is what the waterfall diagram looks like, and I made these little blue so it reminds you of water. But the important thing to remember here is this is a process, and it doesn't necessarily go one direction downhill. Just like if you had a dam, it can pump things back up. We have design outputs, you perform a verification test to make sure it meets the design inputs. If it fails this test, if it fails your verification test, then you have to go back and update your design inputs. At the end of the process, when you have a physical device, you're going to do a simulated use test or a cadaver test or an animal test or a human clinical study to show that it actually does what it's supposed to do for the user needs, and they call that validation. So verification is usually a benchtop test to show that it passes some tests like sterility or biocompatibility, whereas validation is making sure it performs the intended use of the device. So that's the explanation of a waterfall diagram. There's a required procedure that explains this whole process, so you have to have a procedure for it. And two of the clauses that weren't covered in the ISO standard before were design transfer and design history file. Those are now covered in clause 7.38 and 7.310 of the ISO 1345 2016 standard. For those companies out there that are wondering, well, we're just a class 1 device, we don't have to do that. I just had a client from Canada contact me yesterday. They got an inspection finding showing, oh, you don't have design controls. They had a class 2 device that was exempt, but only exempt from a 510K submission, not exempt from GMPs. So it'll actually say on the classification page whether it's exempt or not from GMPs. And so you need to look at that. If your device is 510K exempt and it's a class 2 device, it's typically not exempt from quality system requirements, and you have to implement design controls. So the FDA will be looking for design reviews, approved design inputs, approved design outputs, verification and validation of all your changes as well. And there are some class 1 devices that also require design controls, and I've listed those here. And part of the reason is surgeons' gloves are sterile. And this is a device that they consider. I actually have a device that's a client that's working on a protective restraint. They have design controls. So these 5 categories are regulations or device classifications that require design controls, even though they're a class 1. There are 3 sections in the ISO standard, 731, 738, and 739, that require a procedure. In my quality system procedure, so we have a complete turnkey quality system that you can actually purchase on our website. We've combined design controls and design transfer into one procedure, that's SYS 008 or System 8. And the change control procedure for design changes, whether it's before the design is completed or after the design is completed, that is System 6 or SYS 006. And if you want to learn more about it, visit our website and click on the SOP page. You do not have to have 2 separate procedures. You could have 3, you could have 1. It's up to you, but you are required to have a documented and approved procedure for those 3 areas. Here are the requirements for records. So each of these clauses has a different requirement for records, and I've listed them all here. And certain ones of these need to be approved, like inputs, outputs, verification, validation, and then the final release of your product also. This is the updated design control flow chart that I created. And you won't find this anywhere else. I created this one myself, and it's evolved over time as I've added more detail. It may look very busy, but I'll walk you through step by step what's included in here. So these 2 humps are what used to be called the 2-hump diagram, or research for the first hump, and the second hump is development. So research and development. And usually a company will be doing research, and then they'll say, oh, we're done doing research and we're ready to launch our product. Well, some of that research was development. You were getting beyond the research phase, and you really needed to start documenting things as development as part of a design history file. Now, ideally, you would have started your DHF way back here when you approved a design plan. But if you didn't create a design plan and you decide way out here, oh, we're ready to go to market and we're ready to submit a 510K, well, now you have to document all that design work that you did retroactively and have possibly a retroactive design review. So in a perfect world, this is where you would start your DHF. Most companies start somewhere out here when they're doing verification and validation, so they have to document all this work retroactively. But I added to this diagram, so not only do we have the phases here of design, and each one of these has a gate, which would be a design review, deciding whether you're ready for the next phase. I also marked the different milestones. I put some timelines on here that are approximate, and you don't know what the gaps will be in between. It depends on the project. But I also put on these blue items up here, these are risk management activities that should be occurring in parallel with design. So the way you do it is not to do all your development work and get to the point where you're ready to put together your 510K and your CE marking submission, and then say, oh, we need a risk management file, and go document all these things in blue in this phase. The idea is to work on it as you go along, and they act as inputs into the design process. So you should be developing a risk management plan when you're developing a design plan. And I actually have a template that we provide as part of our procedure that combines risk and design together and has it broken up into the various phases with all these activities. During this phase, you're determining what your design inputs are. These are all the testing requirements that you're going to have to pass during verification in the pilot phase. This is also where you identify all your hazards. Under the new CE marking requirements, that's one of the requirements, is you have a documented hazard identification document. Well, a lot of companies don't have that or create that at the end when it should be really an input into your design process. These are risk estimation and where you're comparing different risk control options. So should this be battery powered? Should this be electrically powered? How are you going to address each of the possible risks of your device, and how do you trade those off? How do you quantify them? And that's something you have to document in this phase as you're considering the different design options and coming up with prototypes and testing them to see if they work. Once you have a working prototype and you've finalized your design and you've estimated all the risks, now it's time to have verification begin. But before you do that, you do a design review here called a design freeze. And we call it a freeze because you don't want to make any more changes, because now it gets expensive. Now you're going to spend a lot of money for testing. That testing is design verification, but it's also risk control verification. During that phase, you might also start to prepare your benefit risk analysis. We used to call it a risk benefit analysis. A lot of companies say we don't need to do it because the device has acceptable risks, but the Europeans require you to do a benefit risk analysis for all risks, not just the ones that aren't acceptable. So you have to do that benefit risk analysis, and then once you finish your verification, then you're going to do validation. And if your validation requires a clinical study, you're going to have to release it from out into the field. So that's why we call this the release phase. And you might do an initial release under an IDE, an investigational device exemption for a clinical study. You might only use it in animal studies. You might use it in cadaver studies. You might use it in a separate market like Canada, where it might be easier to get approval. And then you'll summarize all your risk management activities together in a final report. So if you have a de novo, you're going to actually have to include this benefit risk analysis. If you do CE marking, you're going to have to include this summary report, and they may ask for all these documents in the design history file. In some 510Ks, they actually want, particularly if it's an abbreviated 510K, they may ask for your risk analysis. And they often ask for risk analysis because your device has software. So most software devices have to provide their risk analysis and hazard identification, traceability matrices. So a lot of this information is required for different parts of different submissions. So you can't just say, no, we're going to do that later. It's supposed to be part of the design process. We've also added down here, this is when the pre-sub process occurs. So you would submit a pre-sub once you have your testing plan together. You would have the pre-sub with the FDA 60 to 75 days later. And then you might get quotes in here, you might prepare some samples. Now you're ready for your final design freeze. And this is where you do that verification testing. That typically takes somewhere in the 12 to 14 weeks time frame. So that's why I'd say 100 days here. That's also when I write the 510K. I write it in parallel with the testing. And then once you submit your 510K, you're waiting 90 plus days for the 510K clearance. And then you can have your final design review and release your product. This is the first phase of design, the concept phase. This is where you plan your design. This is also covered under clause 7.3.2 in the standard. And this is some of the updates that they made when they updated from ISO 1345 2003 to 2016. And they've also added a requirement here for competency. So one of the things I look for as an auditor when I go into a company is, were the people that were participating on the design team and actually signing off on design inputs and outputs, were those people actually competent in risk management and design controls, or did they just sign where somebody told them to? So that's one of the things I look for, and that's one of the things you can expect auditors to be looking for. You also need to show traceability of design outputs to design inputs. So they're expecting to see a traceability matrix. When should you start the DHF? Well, I already covered that back in that diagram, but don't worry if your company is almost ready to submit a 510K and you don't have a DHF. The FDA is not going to come to inspect you until after your product is registered on the FDA website and you actually start shipping your product. So if you haven't shipped any product and you aren't registered with the FDA, they're not going to be looking at the DHF. Now, if you register with the FDA and you don't ship anything, well, first of all, you're spending money on registration that you don't need to spend. So I'm not sure why you're doing that, but they could look at your DHF in that case. So don't register and list the product unless you're actually shipping it. Wait until you're going to ship and then list the product. But when you start your DHF, you can start it late and document things retroactively. And you can say right in your design plan that we started the DHF late and we're documenting things retroactively. That's not uncommon. It's not ideal, but it's not uncommon. Here's an example of what might be in your DHF, but ideally, all the documents that you create during the design process will be in your DHF, and ideally, you would organize them chronologically. Most companies, if they have a binder, they will have tabs in between the various phases. So if you have 5 phases of design, have 5 tabs. And if you have a virtual file system, you'll have subfolders for each of the phases, and it'll be organized that way. And often I'm encouraging clients to update some of these documents as they go. It even says in the standard and in the FDA's QSR, you should be updating your design plan as the project progresses. So don't forget, you should be updating these documents. For those of you that aren't sure what a design traceability matrix is, here's an example of that. A lot of people call it an IOVV. It's an acronym for Inputs, Outputs, Verification, and Validation. The FDA, when they do a software traceability, when they look at a software traceability matrix, they're looking for, have you identified all the hazards associated with your design, and then the inputs, outputs, verification, validation. And they will specifically look at certain hazards that they anticipate, and they want to see that they can trace it across your spreadsheet or whatever tool you've used to document traceability. So this is just one example. We call it a design requirements matrix, which in our matrix has more information than this simple table. But this is about as simple as you can make it, and you can make it as complex as you want as well. And as time goes on, more and more people are using software, which is the best tool to be using because it's a relational database that makes it easy to update things without doing a lot of typing. And if you update it in one place, it'll update in other places as well, particularly if you use the same sterilization process everywhere or whatever the component or process is, the documentation will update in multiple places in your system. Next part of the design process is design inputs. This is phase 2 of the design process, or the feasibility phase. In our design control procedure, we list all the phases by number, and we use these titles as well. You can use any title you want. It doesn't have to be called the feasibility phase, but this is often where companies are demonstrating proof of concept or feasibility of their device and making the very early prototypes. This is also where you might start looking at usability as a design input for your project. And you also might be looking at interoperability with other accessory devices. So those are some things you have to consider in design inputs: is usability, looking at use errors, and looking at interoperability with other accessory devices. And the FDA has actually published some guidance documents for both, but they have a usability standard that's referenced in ISO 1345-2016, and that's that standard. Also, you want to be looking at post-market surveillance. Post-market surveillance should also be an input into risk management, or both into risk management and design inputs. And that's something new that's in ISO 1345-2016. So you have to show post-market surveillance was used. You would look at previous versions of your device. You'd look at competitor products. You'd look at any clinical evaluation that you performed before you've even finished the design of your device. Those should be considered as inputs, not something you do after you've finished your design. A lot of companies write design inputs in a way that I don't recommend. So the best example I have, and I give you several examples here, but the best example I have is for a power supply. If you have a very simple device that's battery powered, a lot of companies will say for their design input, 2 AA batteries or a single AA battery. They might even say Duracell battery. The problem with that is you've already decided what the design output is. It's going to be this brand of battery, this power. It's going to be a AA battery. That's what it's going to be. Well, that's a design output, not an input. And so just because your specification matches your input doesn't mean you did it correctly. Your design input has to be something you're going to test. It has to list the acceptance criteria. A AA battery, people say, well, I reviewed the outputs and they match. It was a design review. We just reviewed the specifications and everything looked good, or we did a print review. That's not a verification test. A verification test for this type of input would be, or I'll list the input, it would be, I want you to put a multimeter on this point and this point and measure what the resistance is across the circuit. And based on that, it has to fall within these criteria. We have to be able to get this amount of current to the light bulb that we're going to turn on, or the circuit board that we're going to power up, or the motor that we're going to drive. So if you can't deliver that amount of current and that amount of power to the motor or circuit board or the light, then that circuit that you designed doesn't work. And it's the whole circuit you have to test, not just the battery. So when the user need is, I have to provide power to the device in order to operate it, your design input is it has to provide this much current and this much power over this circuit. And then your output is the actual circuit and all the components in it. So that's the difference between a poor design input that I see a lot of times and a much better design input where you list a test. And that kind of a test would be more of an internal protocol. But if you're talking about shipping validation, this would be an external standard. Usability, this is an external standard. Biocompatibility, this is a standard. Sorry about that. So good examples of design inputs, bad examples of design inputs. For design outputs, this is the most time-consuming phase. It usually takes the longest. It can take as long as a year. It can take as long as 2 weeks. It depends on how much of a change you're making and if it's a new design or not. But there haven't been any changes from the 2003 to the 2016 version. They're looking for design, specifications, labeling. You should have purchasing information. This is all the specs and all the outputs and all the drawings for your device. And all of this information is going to go in your DMR. So essentially, when you approve that design output, you're also approving an early draft of your DMR. At every phase gate, you're going to have a design review. You can do more than that. You could, in theory, do less. You could do legally just one design review at the very end of the process to release your product. That is allowed, not recommended. The whole point of doing design reviews is to verify that all the activities that you had planned were done and to make any updates to your plan before you proceed to the next phase. So instead of worrying about having really long design reviews, have short, efficient design reviews and have many of them at each phase and update your plan for the next stage rather than having one big long one at the end. It's much more consistent and much more predictable for management if you have a bunch of short ones at each phase. And that way you can say, whoop, this isn't done. Before we go on to the next phase, let's make sure we get this piece done. And let's update our plan. This is also where you should be doing lessons learned. You could discover, hey, we've thought that we were going to be able to go ahead with this project, but we need to mold some components. We didn't realize the lead time on making a brand new mold was going to be 8 weeks or 10 weeks. That's something we need to build into our plan next time. Is we need to release the tooling design ahead of time and order the parts way before we're going to do design verification validation, maybe even potentially before we've had a pre-sub with the FDA, because that's such a long lead time item. So you want to finalize those molded components early. You might want to test whether your plastics are compatible with the sterilization process early. You might want to test your circuits to make sure your battery supply is large enough to power that circuit early. So anything that's a long lead time item, it might change things dramatically. You want to do those earlier than later. You also are required to have an independent reviewer in design reviews. Because you're only required to have technically one design review, you could have just one independent reviewer available once, but my recommendation is to have an independent reviewer at each of the phase gates, and you don't have to have it be an employee. It would be perfect if you had two different design teams and they weren't working on each other's projects, and you could have some cross-pollination of ideas by having one team lead be the independent reviewer for the other team and vice versa. But if you're a small company, you're typically going to ask an outside consultant to help you facilitate the design review and make sure you do it properly and document it properly and sign off as your independent reviewer. In the pilot phase or design verification phase, one of the changes they made is you have to use statistical techniques with a rationale for sample size. That's also under design validation. Otherwise, it's basically the same, but this is where you're going to be performing all your benchtop testing. It could include FEA or simulations, but those are typically involved in the design validation process. And the design verification is typically benchtop testing. Design verification includes biocompatibility testing, sterilization testing, electrical safety, EMC testing, and possibly performance tests. And here are some examples. For design validation, this is the last phase of potentially, if you're doing a human clinical study. If you're not doing a human clinical study and you're just doing simulated use or human factors testing, then this would be part of your pilot phase. So it could be in either phase. But the design validation, once again, you have to provide a statistical techniques with rationale for the sample size. And you're looking at typically as tests, simulated use testing, preclinical testing in animals, cadaver testing, or human clinical studies. Here's examples of them. As I said, finite element analysis would be another example of some validation testing. And here are some best practice examples of each of the different deliverables. So you have user needs in your traceability matrix, inputs, outputs, verification, and validation. Design transfer. This is something that's often misunderstood, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this item. Design transfer is not something that occurs on a single day. I'll go back to my diagram. Design transfer is up here. Design transfer begins when you have design freeze. It means we're not going to make any changes to outputs anymore. So it's the process of getting your approved design, your outputs, all the way to final commercial release. So that means you still have to do all your verification tests. You have to do all your validation tests. You have to get regulatory approval. You have to validate the production process. So you might have made prototypes, but you don't have a production process yet. So you've got to take it from prototype to commercial scale. That requires some process validation. You might get it approved in one country, but you don't have it approved in the other countries. So this whole process could take years, depending on how complex it is and what the regulatory hurdles are. If you have a very simple process, it's a 510K device and it's a Class 2 device in Canada and a Class 2A product in Europe, it could be very quick and you might not have to do any clinical studies, and you could potentially launch it on all 3 countries all simultaneously. But typically this takes a while, months of time to complete design transfer. If you acquire the product from another company, you would at least perform design transfer. Even if they have a finished design, you need to make sure that all the DHF documentation they provide meets all the requirements of your design control procedure. And if there are any gaps, you need to fill those gaps. and you want to approve the procedures and put them in your system. Make sure you have a bill of materials, make sure you have an item master, make sure you have lot requirements, inspection requirements, all the vendors you have supply agreements with, you've audited the vendors. There's a lot of things to do to get it from we've approved the design to we can commercially release this and ship product. That's what design transfer is. It's not just I approve the drawing. That's design freeze. It's all the things that occur from the time I approve the drawing to the time that I commercially release. And there's a lot of things to do there. And that doesn't mean you're not going to change any of your drawings. You might update drawings that you freezed, but they might not be a change in spec. They might be, we've identified the vendor, we've added an inspection criteria. Those are the kinds of changes we typically see on outputs during this design transfer phase. So you approve the spec, but you didn't approve all your inspection criteria and the vendor and where they're going to come from and how they're going to be shipped, what the lot sizes are going to be. All that information is part of design transfer. So let me go back to design transfer. Okay, so clause 7.38 is where we have design transfer. It's not a single event. And this is the stage where you would create a device master record and a technical file index. If you're smart, you have these as the same document. So it's an index. You're allowed an index for both of these. And you could have it serve double duty and just approve one document instead of two, save you some paperwork and a lot of revision and maintenance. This is where I recommend you create a post-market surveillance plan. Even though the FDA doesn't require it for all products, it's required in the ISO standard and it's required for CE marking in Canada. And then this is also where I recommend revising your risk management plan. At the beginning of the design process, you had a risk management plan that took you through the design process, but now you need a risk management plan for collecting post-production data and documentation from the field on risks, and you need to update your risk management documentation as you go along, as you collect complaints, as you perform service, and as you gather more post-market clinical follow-up data. So I recommend combining your post-market surveillance plan and your risk management plan into one document that's a post-market combination document. And I usually include that as a reference in this DMR tech file index. For design changes, this is another clause that's included in there. The FDA now, well, not only does the FDA require that you conduct design changes, but now the ISO standard requires you have a procedure for this. And so our procedure is SYS 006, and this is where you're documenting whether the change is approved or not, but you're also documenting all the verification and validation testing that you did. One of the most common 483s is you didn't sufficiently revalidate after the design change before commercially releasing it. And often the way that gets found is you had complaints because you didn't properly validate it. So it's really important to make sure you re-verify and revalidate before you release a change to a product. Other things that you want to be looking for in the design change documentation is a new regulatory submission required? We have a template that we provide with people that purchase our design control procedure called a letter to file. It takes all the questions in the decision tree for the FDA guidance documents for device modifications and device modifications for software products. We took both of those guidance documents, we combined it into one template that asks you all the questions and helps you determine whether a 510K is required for a change that you're making. I just had a company in the last 24 hours ask me, do we need to submit a new 510K for adding UDI labeling to our product? No, you don't. UDI is not something that's considered a significant change. Yes, it's a change, so you would document it and you'd update your labeling, but you're not going to submit a 510K for that. In fact, the UDI labeling doesn't even get considered during the 510K review process, and typically you can't complete the whole UDI process until you have the UDI or have your 510K cleared, because you can't update the information in the GUDID database without the K number. So that's why that has to happen in that order. You get your 510K first, then you finish your UDI process, And so adding that is not considered a significant change and doesn't require a 510K. But there are other changes that would. So if you removed a contraindication, that would definitely require a new submission to the FDA. So if you have any questions about what should be a design change and what needs a new submission, we can help you with that. But you should really have a procedure for that that walks you through significant changes. And they have not only the 2 FDA guidance documents, but they have Canadian guidance document and a European guidance document about significant changes that should be considered in your design change procedure. You also are required to have a design history file. In the ISO standard, it says in clause 7.310 that you must have medical device files or design files. So that's where they've added that requirement. It wasn't in there before, but it's always been in the ISO standard. I'm sorry, it's always been in the QSR as 820.30J. And all it is a collection of all your design records for the entire project. One of the things that probably should not be so prominently displayed in the DHF is every single meeting minutes. So you might, if you're really organized, you'll have meeting minutes for every single meeting you have over the last 18 months or so. Typically that's put in an appendix at the end. I wouldn't put that in each of the phases of your document. Instead, I would put that in an appendix at the end, and I would just have the documentation that you approved for the design reviews in each of the 5 tabs for each of the 5 phases. And I would put those detailed meeting minutes at the end as an appendix. They're still part of the DHF, but it's not the priority for a reviewer, so bury it at the back. Not to hide it, just to make it easier for the reviewer to get through your DHF in a timely manner. So when do you close the DHF? A lot of people keep their DHF open and they keep on updating it every single time they do a design change. That's not the way you want to do it. Even the FDA has recommended don't keep your DHF open after you've gotten a 510K clearance. It's much easier for an inspector to review a DHF if it's tied to a 510K release. If you make post-release changes, so you got your 510K, you release the product, and now you make a change, those should be letters to file, and they should be an update to your DMR and your technical file, but they shouldn't be an update to your DHF. And then if you make a change that's significant enough, or you have enough changes that it triggers a new 510K, start a new DHF at that point for that smaller change, and that's probably going to be a special 510K. So that's how you document changes to a DHF. You document them in the DMR rather than the DHF itself. And if the changes are significant enough, you need a new regulatory filing, then create a new design history file for device modification. And that's where you would summarize, here are the running changes that were made on letters to file in the process since the last time we got a 510K. The next section is maintaining effectiveness. So one of the things that you need to do is maintain the effectiveness of your design process. This is one of the things that we want to do during a management review. We want to make sure that all our processes are effective, but maintaining effectiveness of a design process, you want to have meeting minutes. You want to make sure that all the things that people are responsible for to the next meeting are documented. You assign responsibilities, you have target dates, and you follow up on that. You should use an index for your DHF, is my recommendation. You don't have to, but it's certainly a lot easier to look at a table of contents than try to thumb through the whole entire thing. It makes it much easier for people to locate things and auditors to audit your DHF. If your procedure changes, your design control procedure changes over an 18-month period, which is not all that uncommon, it happens all the time. My recommendation is for any projects that are in process, implement the change to the procedure at the next design review. For any new projects, you'll implement it at the beginning of the project. So that's one way to phase in changes, just like if you made a change to a design. What are you going to do with the open POs versus new POs? New POs, of course, will be the new approved specification, but open POs, like blanket orders, how will you phase that in? And you usually document that in the approval of the change. And you want to make sure that this is for streamlining the process. Try to make it as simple and streamlined as possible. don't have 40 different people approve every single change during the design process. The product's not on the market. So if the product's not on the market yet, don't have everybody approve it. The simplest would be just have the author of the change and the project lead approve it. Now, once you get to the point where you're at design freeze, it's going to get expensive. Once you get to the point where you're doing clinical studies, now it actually could risk patient health and safety. So I would have one level of control after design freeze, and that would be very tight. And a whole another level, if we're going to do a clinical study, probably I would just use the same exact controls that I would have for a product that's actually already approved and on the market. I would say we need to go through this and decide whether a new IDE needs to be submitted or an amendment to that IDE. Do we need to update our protocol? Do we have to redo any testing? All those things should be considered if you're in the middle of a clinical study. But if you're just doing benchtop testing, the worst that's going to happen is you're going to have to repeat some testing and it's going to cost you some more money. So there is a difference, and let the risk of those changes in the implications of it determine how many signatures you want and who needs to sign off. Now, we get to auditing and training. If you are going to audit design controls, number one, the person needs to be trained on design controls. They should also be trained on risk management. They should also know what's involved in doing a design project. So you don't want to have to explain to the person what is design and how do we document it. The person should be telling you how to do that. They should be an expert in this area. Ideally, if you have multiple design team leads, you could have them audit each other's files as well as participate as independent reviewers. But you can't audit your own work. So you might need an outside auditor to come in and audit that if you don't have anybody that's in the company that isn't working on the project and is qualified as an auditor and knows design. So a lot of small companies, that is the case, and we'll do an audit of design controls when we do an independent audit for them. You want to bias your sampling of design changes. And a lot of people are under the impression that auditors sample on a random basis. No, auditing is never a random sampling. You could do that, but usually you want to get the most value out of your auditing time. So pick design changes that were significant. Pick design changes that led to a complaint or an adverse event. Pick things you know that are going to be a problem, bias your sampling to see if the company adequately determined whether validation that was going to be performed was adequate and whether revalidation was required. So look at the NCRs, look at the service, look at complaints, look at adverse events and recalls to bias your sampling. And as I said, the auditor needs to be familiar with the risk management, the design control requirements, and the auditor should be familiar with all the regulatory requirements for design changes. So they should know those two FDA documents for device modifications, the Canadian significant change document and the European significant change document, and they should be familiar with the process of notifying their notified body, their importers, their distributors, and their authorized reps as economic operators for any changes to a CE marking product in the new MDR. This here is a diagram that I created for a model that I came up with for auditing. It's a little different from what everybody else uses. You might be familiar with turtle diagrams, and I actually have a whole entire webinar about turtle diagrams and the process approach to auditing. But in there, I explained this model. It's the adjacent link diagram. The adjacent links are these blue links. So you would have design, purchasing, production process, receiving inspection, final release of product, and then customer service. Those would all be the blue links. But then the red links are the flow of information and the flow of records between the processes. So a purchase order would be an example of a red link. It's communicating information from the purchasing person to the supplier, and that would also get passed on to the receiving inspector to make sure that what you ordered is what you received. The other things you're going to be looking at in these red links is equipment, maintenance records, any validation that needs to be done, including validation of software, who's doing the work and their training and competency and effectiveness of that training. You want to look at metrics, any quality objectives that might have been established for that process. In the procedures and forms, make sure they're adequately documented in the procedure and form matches what they're actually doing. So all these red links are adjoining links that you want to be looking at very carefully. And typically we'll have, when we interview the process owner, we'll ask them to describe the process in their own words, then look at the inputs, the outputs, the equipment, and in the facilities, look at the people involved, the procedures and forms, and then the metrics. In that order, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you could go out of order, that's not a problem, but you can actually draw that diagram as a turtle diagram. But this is an adjacent link model that will help you. And if you're interested in learning more about the adjacent link model for auditing, check out this webinar that I created on the process approach. Oh, I also have this hyperlink up here. It tells you how to audit design. I actually wrote a whole blog on how to audit design. If you're looking for more helpful links on how to conduct design controls, here's a bunch of guidance documents and articles that were written about design controls, so you can check these out. There's one about risk as well, and risk management, technical files, planning of design, and this is the guidance from the FDA on Do It by Design, I believe is what it's called. And finally, if you have any questions, and I've gone through this material really fast, and there is a lot of material in here. You can listen to the recording as many times as you want, and if you want, you can schedule a meeting with me and you can ask additional private questions on a one-on-one basis. I can sign a non-disclosure, but this is your opportunity to schedule a meeting with me and ask questions about design and ask how you might modify your own design procedure to meet some of these requirements that are in ISO 13452-2016 or the new MDR. Thank you very much, and hopefully this recording went smoothly. Bye-bye.